Please take your seats. Our session is about to begin. Thank you. Please take your seats. Our session is about to begin. Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Head of Oil Research at Bloomberg NEF, David Doherty.
Hello and thank you. Now, there remains considerable uncertainty around the magnitude and composition of investment required for meaningful decarbonization. Across all of the most commonly referenced climate scenarios, you've got very different populations, very different technologies, and very different energy demand. So our challenge is to understand the capital flows required in any of these worlds. And as we posture our portfolios for the energy transition, we need to understand that investment in net zero is not zero investment in fossil fuels, but what investment is sufficient and aligns with net zero. So for that, we've developed energy supply investment ratios. What is he talking about? So total energy supply is the generation of a joule and the movement of a joule of energy. We take that, we pull it apart into two, fossil and low carbon energy supply. We take those numbers, which for low carbon include renewables like wind and solar. They include transmission and distribution, hydrogen, carbon capture, and also fossil generation that includes abatement technology. So think of a gas plant with CCS attached. We then, on the other side, look at the extraction of coal, oil, and gas, the upstream, midstream, and downstream, and then generation that is not abated. We simply take the two numbers, and we apply this ratio. How are we performing so far? In the last couple of years, we've seen that investment jump to 0.82 trillion on the low carbon side. Pretty smooth from 2000 upwards. Fossil fuel has been a bit bumpier, right about 0.9 in 2022, based on IEA estimates. This is OPEX and CAPEX. And like you can see, if we apply this ratio and put them together, we have yet to pass the 1-for-1 number. So we've had a peak at 0.97 in 2020, predominantly as fossil fuel investment dropped off. And we're at 0.9 now. So we know where we are, but what does this net zero world I'm talking about even look like? To do that, we look at scenarios. And there's a lot of scenarios out there, so we have to narrow it down. We look at ones that are net zero by 2050 or soon after, and they limit global warming to 1.5 by 2100 with limited or no overshoot. There's a lot, like I said, out there again, so we limit it again to those major intergovernmental bodies or those that have significant responsibility delegated to them by government authorities. So it's the International Energy Agency, the Network for Greening the Financial System, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These worlds that they paint are all very different, but some of the things they include are rapid urbanization. We move to smaller homes and use digital energy management to limit our consumption. They include a usership model, stop buying cars, use Grab instead. Electrify everything that we can electrify. And in order to power those electric end uses, it's renewable energy that we rely on, wind and solar. There is a rapid uptake of new technologies, but there's limited in terms of different innovations. Are you going to hop on an electric airplane anytime soon from London? I don't think so, Stephanie, right? No. So for those that cannot be decarbonized easily, carbon capture and technology is still used in order to get towards that net zero goal. Other things, they include afforestation, but to a limited amount. They include ambitious climate policies. This includes international climate finance and redistribution of carbon taxes. They focus on global cooperation. I know, don't smile in 2022. But what this means is that we try to ensure that there's a security of fuel and that there's no limitations in getting energy where it needs to be. But with that said, what dollar numbers do we need in order to obtain this net zero world? So we start by taking a look at the IEA's net zero emission scenario from 2021. They anticipate over the 2020s, $24 trillion is required. That's $2.4 trillion per year. This increases over the 2030s to 3 and increases to 2.5 to get 78.5 over the whole of this outlook. All of these different scenarios that we include, and there are 7, have different stories altogether. And that's what I mean by normalizing this across all of the scenarios. Otherwise, it's really impossible to anticipate how you're supposed to perform. You can see the different scenarios, some that envisage a low demand world, like this light blue and yellow one, require far less investment because there's far less energy consumed. If we pull these numbers apart, though, and we look at new energy investment versus fossil fuel energy investment, there are some common dynamics. Ones that sprint towards decarbonization require a lot of money now, and we're already late. Others that scale it differently, where we decarbonize the advanced world now and the advancing world later, see a peak towards the 2040s. But the most common denominator in all of these is that fossil investment declines in every single scenario. When we apply our ratios to these numbers, we get quite a messy graph and a couple of outliers, which is every analyst's dream. But when we pull that all together, we do get a bit of a clear range. So what this tells us is that in order to stay on track for those numbers by 2050, for every dollar you put into fossil fuel investment in the 2020s, you'll need to put $4 in to low carbon energy supply. That jumps to 6 across the 2030s, and then 10 across the 2050s and 2040s. But let's step back, because I don't plan on working that far out. Let's have a look at where we are now today. We've done pretty well in increasing it from about 0.5 at the start of the century to 0.9 today, but anybody here can tell you we're really not there. If we want to stay on track this decade, we need to increase that in a linear form to at least 7 to 1 by 2030 to stay on track. So lots of work to do. But as you're leaving the New Economy Forum today, I think the question you should ask yourself when you go back and you're thinking about where your next investment is, what your strategy looks like, should not be, can we get there, or how can we get there? It should really be, how can we even get there fast enough? Because we have a lot of work to do this decade. Thank you very much.
Please welcome our panellists, Chief Executive Officer of Future Fund, Raphael Arndt, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, John Graham, Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of Temasek Holdings and Temasek International, Dylan Pillay Sandra Sagara, Chief Executive Officer of FCLT Global, Sarah Williamson, and our moderator, Vice Chair and Senior Advisor of the Eurasia Group, Gerald Butts.
So, folks, I think our last speaker set the stage pretty well. We need a lot of money, and we don't have very much time. So it's great that Sarah and you and I get to share the stage with about $1 trillion.
Good.
I thought it would be good, as someone who's there's nobody better to set the stage for us, Sarah. Perhaps you could talk about where you see ESG investing, but more importantly, from a broad perspective, where are we? Are we any closer to a solution now than we were 10 years ago?
Well, I think we're getting there, but I think that what we all have to recognize is, as investors, is that it used to be that the investor's goal was really to hit a financial target, beat a benchmark, outperform your peers, be able to pay your liabilities, whatever it was. But over time, what's happened is that the objectives have broadened, and it's no longer good enough just to hit those financial metrics. Those are still very hard to do. Doing any of those things is difficult in and of itself. But the objectives have broadened. And so when we think about something like climate, then investors are put in a position of how do they deal with that. And they need to make real choices, and they need to be clear about their choices. So what we see in this world is there's a lot of confusion, and part of that is because people use the same words for different things. People have tried to obfuscate things and sort of mix them all together. So the way that we think about breaking this puzzle apart a little bit, particularly when it comes to climate, is if you think about a portfolio, what can you do? You could be silent in a portfolio, just not say anything about climate, and that may make sense, cash or something else. You can be principled. I'm not going to buy something because I think it's wrong. People have done that forever. People, tobacco or landmines or whatever it may be. Or I'm going to invest in something that's not economic because I think it's right. You can also be analytic, which is what we think is just plain good investing. The world is changing, so not thinking about ESG or climate change would not be prudent. I mean, if you're going to invest in a real estate development, you probably want to know if you're in a floodplain, right? It's pretty basic. It's just plain old good investing. And then the last is to be catalytic. And I think to your point on the amount of money on the stage, that's what big investors can do. They can frankly throw their weight around a little bit. They can engage with companies. They can create new markets, and they can really sort of smooth the path for others. So I think we are making progress. I think that a few years ago, this was a sideline conversation. Now it's not. But we're not there yet.
Great. Dylan, we're on your home turf here. How do you feel about the progress that's being made toward these catalytic investments, as Sarah put it?
Well, what we've seen over the years is that more and more private capital is going towards the solutions that we need to have to contribute towards a net zero world. We've seen more capital going to very early stage tech-based solutions, and that will help over time with more. If we can capitalize more capital, we will come to a stage where the carbon abatement cost curve will come down when we can start to commercialize this and put it into the market and mainstream them. I think we're also finding that the traditional players are willing to be partners with these early stage companies. We also see more infrastructure spend going in to build the infrastructure needed for energy transition, for example. And we see more and more the fact that not just countries are committing net zero, but companies are committing net zero. And they're doing things about that. They're setting metrics for themselves. I mean, we ourselves have a metric that in 2030, the carbon emissions that are attributable to our share of companies in our portfolio will be half of what it was in 2010. It's not easy for us because we actually own an airline. But we're all committed to doing that, because if we don't, then we're not going to get to where we need to get to. So for some of us who have a portfolio of companies which are in hard-to-abate sectors, the issue is multifold, right? Number one is that we've got to encourage the companies to be on a journey to decarbonize. And that means what they can do to ensure a just transition. And it's not just about transitioning in terms of the technology or going into a lower carbon emitting business or where your carbon intensity is lower. It's also about the workforce. How do you then take care of the transition of the workforce, which comes to the S part to some extent. But for us as a shareholder, as an investor, how do we invest in things which are useful for those companies? So, for example, in the context of the airline, while the airline is doing its bit to invest in new aircraft which are 25 to 30% more fuel efficient than the fleet it's replacing, we need to think about investing in sustainable aviation fuels, because that is going to be a driver for them to be able to comply with CORSIA requirements. That's just an example. So there is a role for governments to set a framework for which we can all operate under. In the US, with the IRA, that's a good example of something like that. You need to think about carbon pricing as well in that context. You need the companies to decide what it means for them to be responsible in the context of transition and the journey they want to take. You need investors to bring capital to bear so that we can contribute towards not just infrastructure, but the solutions which are out there. So I think it requires all of us to come together to do something about it. And I think that we've seen more movement in the last few years than I would have expected.
And at the end of the day, of course, so tell us a little bit about how you think about the core business case for ESG investing at CPPIB.
Yeah, and maybe I'll build a little bit on what Dylan mentioned and talk about the kind of the evolution we've gone through at CPP Investments. And a couple of years ago, we thought, and I'll focus mainly on sustainability, mainly on climate. A couple of years ago, we really viewed it through a risk lens. and really thought about transition risk, physical risk, how we do security selection, incorporating physical risk, transition risk, how we think about the resilience of the broader portfolio. But slowly we kind of evolved our mindset into thinking that this is actually a generational investment opportunity. And we're actually really excited about it. And it's one of the areas that we've been really building out internally, building out capabilities that the world will do what it can to transition to a low carbon future. And I see numbers of 50, 70, I think I saw 120 trillion actually yesterday. I don't know what the number is, but it's a really big number of capital that will be required. And it's not just a transition from fossil fuels to renewable. It's the entire economy that needs to transition. It's aviation, it's steel, cement. The entire economy needs to transition. And that, for long-term patient capital, presents an incredible investment opportunity. So we have a mandate of maximizing return without undue risk of loss. But we viewed that this is something we want to be an active participant in. We made a net zero commitment earlier this year. We've been building out a team dedicated to investing in the transition. And again, not just investing on the energy side, but actually working with companies and trying to invest in heavy emitting sectors and work with them to become more green and hopefully make money selling the green dollars on the back end. So for us, as we think about, again, that investment opportunity, this is where we can see the next 10 years providing some of the best investment opportunities.
And you see that across the economy, not just in the energy sector?
Yeah, we see it across the entire economy, right? It's an entire economy transition. We've been creating a framework to apply to all our portfolio companies and looking at the carbon within the company and at what cost of carbon can we remove the carbon. And the first asset we did it on was actually a retail asset. It was a shopping mall in the UK. And not what you'd think of immediately, but a shopping mall in the UK, and coming to the view that we could remove the majority of the carbon with really marginal investment in CapEx. Some of it will be very difficult to remove, but instead of waiting, let's just start now and remove the carbon we can.
It's very interesting. Raphael, you're from a country that has seen, call it a stop-and-go approach to climate policy over the past 20 years, to be diplomatic. And our house view at Eurasia Group is that the energy transition, while it's happening, will be a lot more disruptive and bumpier than people expect it to be. Could you reflect on that from your perspective as an Australian investor?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the world's never been in a position before where we sort of collectively decided to retire an enormous industry of capital stock that's still effective, at least from an economic point of view. And to your earlier point about how much the world has changed, there's no argument anymore as I move around financial circles about whether we're doing this. We've just had a whole series of multilateral meetings right across the world. Everyone agrees we're doing it and we need to do it. The question is how, and how do you make it fair and affordable for people? And so I think whether it's Australia or anywhere else, there's the politics, and ultimately the politicians all across the world have to set the policy, and the policy will either help or impede private capital to come and solve the issues. But actually, the private markets have been getting on with it anyway, and there's been an enormous amount of investment in renewables and other types of technology and research. Australia's, I think, got the highest take-up of rooftop solar in the world, for example. That's actually causing issues with the power grid, because in the middle of the day when it's sunny, actually there's not much demand, which is a great problem to have, but you need to bring capital to solve that. So I think for people like us, all of us, I think, now in the world are really fortunate that there are big pension funds, sovereign funds who are organising capital and who are thinking long term. And so Sarah's job is to bring those people together and talk to the companies to make sure they're focused on the right thing in the long term. And in the long term, there's no debate, there's no tension between the right thing and the good investment, because ultimately, if it's going to be a sustainable investment that will pay off, it has to be both.
Yeah, and there are two things coming, there's a lot coming up in this conversation, and thank you. But there are two things in particular that strike me as someone who's worked on this issue for a long time and have many of the scars to prove it, which my fellow Canadian knows all about. One is just how uniform we all are on the macro picture, right? That the direction of travel is set. We can debate the velocity, whether it's sufficient, et cetera. But it's pretty clear it's set. And 20 years ago, that would not have been the case had people in your position been having this discussion. The second, though, and I think it's really important to recognize, is just as you put it, Raphael, the magnitude of the task. We really are trying to accomplish something that's never been done before. So I wonder if you could each talk a little bit about the obstacles, as frankly as you feel comfortable speaking of them, between you and your part of that task. And maybe I'll go in reverse order, sure. Raphael. So,
well, you can see it happening in Europe right now. You know, yeah. if you move too quickly, people still
There's something happening in Europe right now?
You know, affordability is a big issue, and I think there's plenty of parts of the world that still don't have cheap and reliable power, and that's an issue for social outcomes as well. And so being planful is really important, and recognising that we're a fossil fuel economy still in the world, and we need to transition in a sensible and equitable way will help. And so I think as the world, unfortunately in the last few years, the world politically has got more partisan, more populist, and it's impeding those conversations. So I think the best thing that can happen, and it is happening, I think, is a consensus understanding, and then we can use the technology and the sensible people who know what to do. I'll just make one other comment. I don't think there's a shortage of capital in the world for these sort of investments. There is no shortage of capital. There's plenty of capital. The issue is having the framework set up so it's clear and transparent, and that capital will come.
John?
I think an area where there continues to need to be improvement is in metrics.
In metrics.
In metrics and in measurement and accounting standards. As mentioned, we've made a 2050 net zero commitment. And our portfolio, that's for our portfolio. And in our portfolio right now, we only actually have data for about 30% of the portfolio. So we actually have data from companies, about 30% of the portfolio. The rest of the portfolio, we proxy, we estimate, we take industry averages. And undoubtedly, as the metrics improve and they get refined, the numbers move around.
Right.
And so there's volatility in the numbers. And I always ask our team, is this movement real, or is it just volatility? And sometimes you get a shoulder shrug and say, well, we had some restatements, we had some companies change the numbers. So as a global investor, and as we think about a global transition, having the ability to have, consistently compare companies, assets across the world, that'll be a huge help to the investment community.
Right. And Dylan, one of the things that I've been thinking about on this topic as far as Temasek is concerned is no matter what, how successful we are, we're still going to be dealing with a climate that's quite different than the one that we've grown up with and lived our lives in. And you, as an asset owner, you're there the morning after. So how do you think about that problem? Because I think it's a difficult one, to say the least.
Yeah, it's very difficult, right? If you're a manager of assets, you can decide to get in and out of a position if you choose to do so based on your portfolio construction and the returns environment that you are in. If you own assets for the long term, then, and especially if they're assets that you control, then you really have the morning after. It's not just left to the boards and management teams. So it's a question of how we decide to set our goals and targets, and then how we have that brought to our portfolio companies and make sure they are on their own journey, because we can't run these companies for them. They have to run these companies themselves. But they have to understand that if they're there to deliver long-term sustainable returns to us, for us to deliver long-term sustainable returns to our stakeholders, then they have to be on that journey. And it's a question of making sure that everyone's under the tent. Now, we're quite fortunate at Temasek that we have a very heavily concentrated portfolio. So in a sense, unlike CPPIB, we have, I think, a better visibility into where we are in terms of our carbon emissions today across the portfolio, and therefore the metrics that we need to hit. But we do have companies into hard-to-abate sectors. So the built environment, aviation, power generation. We have a port operator with 52 ports around the world. So all of these things require you to have solutions not just for today, but for tomorrow, which means they have to run their business today to do well in order to generate the capital, in order to do what's right, and therefore at the end of the day also do what's good. Now that's not easy to do, but it's a journey, and they have to figure out how they're going to be able to execute that plan according to the business they're in and the external dynamics as well. Because most of our companies can't do things without the rest of the ecosystem doing it as well. So you can only catalyze action if you can show what's the benefit that you're bringing to your ecosystem partners. Otherwise, you can do all you can. If the other side doesn't come to the table, you're not going to have the outcomes that you want to get, and you're not going to have the outcomes for which you put your capital at risk for.
Right.
And so that's something that we look at very carefully when we look at our companies.
I want to do a bit of an optimism check here. We've got a poll. This is the privileged panel to have the only poll of the day, I'm told, Sarah, and I'm going to do that optimism check with you in a second, but let's check in with our audience. If you could answer the following question, or description of ESG factors. In your opinion, are ESG factors A, an essential tool in responsible investing, B, promising but unproven, C, just an excuse for money managers to charge you fees, or D, partly to blame for the global energy crisis? We won't show the answer for a little while, so you have time to do it, but how do you feel about how the conversation's going, Sarah? Are we too optimistic here?
No, I don't think we're too optimistic, but I do think one of the things we have to keep in mind is the link between paper portfolios, commitments on paper, and real-world decarbonization. And I think this conversation has already reflected on that. You're talking about, airline fuel, and you're talking about portfolios. And what I'm hearing a lot of in the world of investing is I want to clean up my portfolio. Actually, oftentimes, the easiest way to clean up my portfolio is to sell something dirty to somebody else. Now, that does absolutely nothing for the planet, our future, our children, our grandchildren. So to me, the question is, how do we recognize that in order to clean up assets, we have to own them, and therefore we need to be able to own them. That may go against a net zero commitment in the short term. But the solution is not essentially to take the garbage out of your own house and throw it in your neighbor's yard. That does not work here. And so I think that is something that we've really got to keep in mind.
I think that's such a great point that someone once said to me that everybody takes theology textbooks to climate change as a problem, but it's really math class at the end of the day. There are several trillion tons of carbon in the atmosphere that shouldn't be there, and we're adding to it every year under all of the scenarios that we've been describing. So how do you think about that particular problem? And I'm not going to call on any one of you in particular, but raise a hand.
Well, that's what I was referring to before, and again, to make the point, so I agree with John, like we need metrics so we can know what we're investing in, and I think most developed economies are headed there quickly. Most regulators are already working on that. Emerging markets are struggling to keep up, and so that ultimately will become an impediment for capital for those parts of the world, and they're the ones that need the capital most to build new sustainable infrastructure. So I am optimistic, but I think, as I was saying before, we need to take the heat out of the politics so we can focus on the solutions.
Yeah, I mean, we've been quite clear that we don't believe divestment is the right path forward, and we know how to have a net zero portfolio because we know what we'd have to sell.
Yeah.
But to Sarah's point, we would just sell it to someone else.
To whom? Yeah.
It would have no impact. And so it's what I was referring to earlier of taking an approach, and many others are doing it, is try to build out a real competency, a real capability of being an active, long-term, patient, engaged investor and working with companies on the transition and supporting them through the transition.
It's a difficult thing to do, though, right? These companies don't normally look to their financiers for operational advice in that way. How do you approach that problem set from the perspective of a fund manager?
Well, I think Dylan touched on a little bit. I think what's important as an investor, we don't operate the companies. right? We're there as an investor, and we share our expectations and then use our governance rights, whether that be as a board member or as a public shareholder, to vote. And look, I think you're always looking for that company that's made a net zero commitment and is maybe doing some quiet quitting,
Right.
and really not kind of following through. And then you have to use what governance tools you have to either seek change, or we will sell at that point if we just don't think that it's being taken seriously.
Right. Controversial step to take. Has excited some popular press reaction using your governance powers to make this kind of change happen. Dylan, how do you think about that?
I think you can't force change because it has to come from within, because I think you have to make sure you pull everyone along with you to make it really sustainable in the long term. Because if you're thinking about it, it's not just what you're going to do in the next 10 years. It's going to be the impact of the business model beyond that. And, it's even beyond 2050, if you think about it from that perspective. You want to have companies that are resilient. I mean, I said earlier, we have to build resilient portfolios. Therefore, your company's got to be resilient. It's got to be resilient across cycles. And therefore, it's got to know what it takes to be resilient. So there are few things that are facing companies today, right? Quite apart from the external environment, and you're talking about inflation, you talk about things to do with geopolitics and decoupling and all that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, if we look at your business model, the big issue is transformation of your business model. Whether it's to transform it from a carbon-emitting business into a less carbon-emitting business, into a green business, that's one element. The second element, of course, is that technology is a driver of change going forward. And you can't look at a climate change mitigation, adaptation, transition strategy without looking at technology. But technology has its impact in different ways. The externalities of using technology is that you might need a smaller workforce. What do you then do about your workforce? How do you train them and prepare them for either the transformation that you're going to put into effect, or for alternatives outside of your company, your sector, which allows them to continue to be productive? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if you look at the E and the S goes towards also a form of resilience, but that's more about social resilience. And we all have a responsibility as owners of capital, and how we deploy capital to make sure that while we could be solving one problem, we don't create another. And we try to direct the companies in a way where they can think of both. And then what we do as investors, and I'm sure that's what the Future Fund and CPPIB do, is that we aim to help them think through these issues and work with them to find the solutions. I think that's what we have to do as investors. It's just not about putting our capital to work. I think our capital has to be catalytic. It has to be financial for innovation, growth, transformation, etc. It has to be about human capital. Do we really invest in human capital? Do we value, celebrate human capital? That's important. And it links to a third part, which is social capital. How do you promote social progress and resilience in societies and communities in which you operate? And finally, it's about natural capital, right? The fact that environment is important to create a clean earth for future generations. But the E and S, therefore, has an interlinkage, and we have to be very clear-minded about how we're going to approach this. I'm actually not a fan of metrics when it comes to the S, I'll be quite frank. I have this internal discussion with my ESG folks who love metrics, because they tell me that about sustainable bond framework, I've got to put some metrics there because it's bots who are reading it and not a human being. Well, I said, no, we've got to put a narrative there. If you put stats, you've got to explain the stats so that people know what you're doing, and what you're doing is correct. And they have a right to criticize if they don't think that you're doing it correctly. But I think the S is the most difficult to put a number on, because it covers so many different things. And I think intentionality is the most important. The other thing, if I may mention, is this. We focus a lot about impact for climate, which is important, but we also have to look at impact for communities. And they come together. If we don't think about what's going to happen to uplift communities, especially those in emerging markets which are subject to the vagaries of climate change, I think that's a bigger issue. And that has an adaptation sort of problem to solve.
Well, and I think you're getting to the core of the issue, which is the relationship between the three letters in the alphabet soup. Raphael, how do you think about that? I know you have a...
Well, I think at the end of the day, all these issues are social.
Yeah.
The three of us all represent government investment funds, or if you're a pension fund or a superannuation fund, you've got direct members. And new generations are just thinking about these things in different ways. And so ultimately, if we don't behave in a way that they think is right with their money, then, we won't be allowed to continue to do what we do. So ultimately, doing the right thing on the environmental side, or having decent governance, or making sure you don't participate in modern slavery, or that you're thinking about equity across your staff. All of those things are just good business practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm pleased to report that the audience is at least as optimistic as we are, folks. A clear majority, and it's hard to get a clear majority for anything these days, chose option A, that it's an essential tool for in responsible investing. And the more deleterious options were not chosen by very many people. So I think that's a positive sign for the future. We do have a great question from the audience, from a former colleague of mine, wondering, what do the panelists make of the backlash to ESG from some quarters, particularly in some subnational jurisdictions in certain countries?
Well, I guess as the American on the panel, that means me. Here's the way that I would think about this. There is in many circles, there's an idea that there's a real trade-off. You can be sustainable, or you can make money. You can think about your shareholder, or you can think about your stakeholder. And that is just not supported by the facts. Because if you think about who the stakeholders are in a company, they're the customers, they're employees. You know, I've never seen a company that has created value over long periods of time that says, I don't care about my customers, I don't care about my employees. That's not how companies thrive. So, you know, one analogy that I've thought about on this trade-off thing is, if you remember, in the 1970s, the U.S. car makers thought about quality as a trade-off. Okay, we could invest more money in the cars, but it costs us more, raise the quality. Okay, we know how that story ended, right? The Japanese car companies and other people ate their lunch. So that is essentially what's going on right now, which is people can say, there's a trade-off, I'm not going to deal with that, but then they're not building for the future. So there is pushback in the U.S. I think a lot of it is semantics. Some of it is a confusion between, or an obfuscation between, what are ESG factors, which in my mind are just good investing for the future, thinking about governance, thinking about all the things we've been talking about, versus ESG outcomes. And are you, as a fiduciary, using somebody else's money to further your political goals? That's wrong, and people should push back on that. Or are investors and business people doing the politician's job, which is deciding what social or economic policy should be? That's also wrong and annoys the politicians, because that's their job. So I think that the ESG factor side, using ESG factors to think about how to invest, is really uncontroversial for anybody who thinks about it deeply. The question is more on the other side, which is the outcome side.
I think the "for anybody who thinks about it deeply" might be the operative phrase there, Sarah. How do you guys think about this? Is this an issue is this a real issue that you think about when making final investment decisions, or do you see it as something that's part of the growing pains of ESG and it will fade away as time goes on?
Yeah, you actually touched on a little bit earlier when talking about and you certainly see sometimes a difference in approaches between an asset owner and asset manager, and thinking about how having to live with a decision longer term as an asset owner. And I've been talking mainly on the E side, and we've been focusing a lot on the E side, but I totally agree that if it's like pushing air around a balloon, right? It's a very nuanced discussion, and if you hit too hard on the E, undoubtedly it causes a problem in other parts of the ESG. I think internally at CPP Investments, we don't even like to use the term ESG anymore, because it's three kind of distinct areas that require its own discussion and factors and thinking about it. It is good investing, considering these on all our investments, considered on the portfolio construction. But even the term ESG, I think it just simplifies it too much, and we've actually just moved away from using the term ESG.
General agreement from you guys on this?
I think, you know, the proponents of, I'll say, factoring in long-term externalities over the years have done a tremendous job, and that's why we're sitting here optimistic.
Yeah.
But there are consequences. So if you shut down a coal mine or shut down a whole series of power stations, people lose their jobs and communities lose their lifeblood. And so it's also incumbent on policymakers to think about those things, and they've got just as much right to a fruitful, productive life as anyone else, and that's the long-term social sustainability. So I think what we're seeing in parts of the US is just a natural response to a one-sided conversation that's going on. And I think as the providers of capital, Our job is to look right across the whole ecosystem and say, well, how do we have a managed transition, with managed being the operative word?
Mm-hmm. And Dylan, do you see this as an extraordinary imposition of, extraneous constraints on you as an investor?
I don't think so at all. I think each investor has to think about what its mandate is and what it's supposed to deliver. Now, if our mandate, pension funds, Temasek as an owner of assets, but for the benefit of the Singapore government, for all of us, our mandate is to deliver long-term sustainable returns. So you have to figure out what comes within that bucket to deliver long-term sustainable returns. I don't think you can deliver long-term sustainable returns without thinking about ESG. I don't think you can, especially when you're affiliated with the government. Because at some point in time, the political space will come in if you're not thinking more broadly about where you have to go to try to manage the outcomes that you think are going to deliver the returns, but also other externalities have to be managed along with it. So I think that for us, it's very important to be very clear about our mandate and how we go about making sure we deliver the long-term sustainable returns. That's the first thing. The second thing is that if you own your own assets, you can put aside part of the capital to look at solutions that could actually be good in the long term to catalyze new business models that can create value broadly. And you want to make money from it. I mean, every time we put $1 to work, we intend to get a return from it over and above our cost of capital. We're not there for concession capital. That's not our mandate. But the gestation that it takes to deliver to you the result that you're looking for in terms of returns is the critical issue. Now, if you have a 3 or 5 year or 7 year time frame, it's very difficult to do the things that we have been thinking about in terms of investing properly in ESG, if I still use the 3 words, or for that matter, in energy transition. It's very difficult to do that because your time frame to retool a business model to deliver a just transition doesn't equate with what has to be done. But if you don't have that duration limitation that can go beyond it, then you can think more expansively and figure out how to allocate your capital properly between long-term strategic objectives or strategies and shorter term. By the way, I think the short term is important because there's a discipline in deploying capital of short term, but you also want the returns to help fund the long-term orientation you have for your portfolio. So I think it's really dependent upon the mandate that you have.
Well, this is a much more optimistic discussion than I expected, Sarah. I wonder if you could reflect on one of the barriers that comes up over and over again is the great proliferation of rules, to the point where in early days, early movers in this space have felt the need to internally set their own carbon price, for instance. Do you see that as a risk, that these guys who are investing all over the world are going to have to deal with different sets of rules for what constitutes a net zero friendly or ESG investment?
The short answer is yes. There are different rules in different countries, and I think there is some convergence. The ISSB, I think, is doing a terrific job in pulling together ideas, pulling together metrics, but the chance that there is global convergence on the same metrics is fairly low. What I've been involved in many of these conversations, what I keep telling people is think of it as you're going to a restaurant, okay? And you've got a long menu, and some countries might choose fewer items off of the menu than other countries. Some may choose more. Some are hungrier, right? They want everything on the menu. But can we just make sure it's all either, Chinese food or all French food or something like that? Because if it's all different and all the math is done differently, then the kitchen is a nightmare. Yeah. And that's what's happening to companies and to investors, is that they're trying to serve meals from every different kind of culture, and that's not going to work for a long time. And so that is, I'm hopeful that we will get to a smaller number. I don't think we'll get to 1.
Do you guys feel like this problem is sorting itself out as well? No.
那我们还有很多工作要做，但是呢，我认为这个我们是在做出贡献的。首先，我们没有所有问题的答案。那因此，我们相信呢，我们应该是跟这个志同道合的投资者一起建立这个合作的一个关系。这是一个这个刚刚萌芽的一个领域， 例如在一些指标的数据方面，我们可能需要重新思考，我们是否是在朝正确的方向迈进。所以我们可能
3 million. So, it's a journey, right? We don't have all the answers now, but we clearly, as we all learn together, we and others who are in it are going to be able to come up with the right answers for us to rely on to get to where we have to be. But I want to say one thing. I think we need to have this harmonization. We need to have a taxonomy that works for us all around. It takes some time. In the meantime, we're all going to have to muddle through this issue. And I think in each country, we have to deal with where we see the biggest issue and see how we can come up to the outcome that we think is the right outcome there. So, for example, are people going to be concerned about metrics in some of the emerging markets? The answer is no. How are they going to get to energy transition when they have to deal with uplifting of communities or rural populations? Right. How do you tell someone in India or in Vietnam or elsewhere you can't use coal-fired plants? Well, how are you going to get electricity to the villages? Especially if you don't have the alternative coming in at a cost-effective basis without the green premium being paid by a population that has a per capita income that's 1/10 of that of your own country. How do you do that? Yeah.
It's an easy question to answer in the last minute of the panel, John.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question. I'd say we're still definitely on the metric side in the proliferation stage, which is also fine, and people are excited and enthusiastic. At some point, we need to transition to consolidation, and need to think about consolidating some of these. But at least there's enthusiasm. At least people are focused on it.
Sarah, I'm going to give you the last word. Are you feeling good about the future?
I do feel good about the future. I think we are going in the right direction. I think we're going to have a lot of twists and turns. I think the key thing for us is, to remember this is a marathon, not a sprint. And when we get tired, just, keep going. So it's going to take a while, but I think we're going in the right direction.
Anyway, I don't think anyone wants an investor who's a pessimist.
Yeah.
Right? Realist optimist is the best outcome.
Yeah, and I'm a credit investor, right? So.
That is a terrific, right on point, right on time ending. So thank you all for participating in this discussion. I hope the audience enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Managing Director of APAC at Bloomberg New Economy, Justin Finnegan.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to follow up on something Mike said that was very important this morning. We've been building this forum for 5 years, and one of Mike's most important visions for this forum is not to make it just a talk shop. He really thinks that collective action can only be done when we bring global leaders from around the world and to solve some of the most important challenges. And with that, you might have noticed today he made a big announcement about launching the Bloomberg New Economy Climate Technology Coalition. We're extremely excited to launch this coalition to bring leaders from around the world to identify and rapidly scale technologies faster than we've ever had, and to bring in new technologies in the green climate space. And with that, we've collected some of the best leaders from around the world, from many different countries, many different sectors, with the influence, the resources, and the drive to take action. And with that, we're launching the coalition, and I'd like to premiere a short video to show what we have in store. So thank you.
The Bloomberg New Economy Climate Technology Coalition. The climate crisis is one of the greatest challenges facing humanity. Collective action is needed now more than ever to save our planet. It took several decades for renewables to reach today's scale. We cannot wait that long for the next generation of climate technology solutions. The Bloomberg New Economy Climate Technology Coalition is led by a global steering committee of established leaders from across sectors. They have set an ambitious agenda to identify and rapidly scale the next generation of climate-critical green technologies that will be instrumental in achieving the world's climate goals. Join us. BloombergNewEconomy.com/coalitions/climate technology.
Please welcome our panelists, President and Chief Executive Officer of Creo Syndicate, Regine Clement. Chief Executive Officer of Holcim, Jan Jenic. Group Chief Executive of HSBC, Noel Quinn. Chief Executive Officer of Envision Group, Lei Zhang. And our moderator, Senior Contributor at Bloomberg NEF, Nathaniel Bullard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Now, I'm going to start with a very brief bit of housekeeping, which is this. You have phones, I have an iPad. Send me questions. I've got questions coming out my ears on my own, but I really would like to have some from the audience. Thank you to my panelists. Thank you all for being here. And just going to start with the scene setting, which is a challenge to do a very deep decarbonization of the global economy in a series of decades. Something that's going to cost trillions, maybe $150 trillion in that time. Something that also is taking place at a moment that could be seen as derailing any sort of options that are happening. Inflation, war, very, very tight supply and demand balances, and the sort of thing that could cause people to sort of rethink the strategies in the past that they've been on. And I think the most important thing we can interrogate today is what has been different in the past year since we convened here last in Singapore and had a similar kind of conversation about plans for getting us, if possible, to net zero by the middle of the century. So I'm going to go round robin here very quickly through my panelists and let them talk a bit about themselves, where they play a role in decarbonization, and give us a sense of their landscape. What's changed, what's working, and where they think we are. Regine, I'm going to start with you.
Great. It's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. So Creo, which stands for Clean, Renewable, Environmental Opportunity, we're a nonprofit, and our goal since 2010 is to help facilitate and catalyze capital into, and high impact capital into climate solutions and decarbonization. We do this by working with families, so ultra high net worth families, family offices, their family foundations, and also family businesses. Why families matter? Because they manage over 10 trillion globally in their family offices, because we're going to see more than 18 trillion of wealth transferred to new wealth owners by 2030. And also because they own a big part of the private economy. And so we're talking a lot about different stakeholders and their roles in decarbonization, but we don't often hear about families and their role in this work. And so Creo early on decided to partner. We started off with American families. We now work with 200 in 25 countries. And these families are quite active in investing in solutions and decarbonization. Last year, we invested in solutions over, well, almost $4 billion just last year, and kind of tens of billions in transition. So what we call transition is reallocating capital when you're working with third-party managers and giving climate goals to those managers to actually invest in solutions. We have a portfolio of 1,200 climate companies, and so we're likely the largest portfolio in the world, if you allow me to call it an aggregated portfolio. We've invested in more than 210 climate funds, and the way we partner with them, we help them find the relationships they need to do the best investing. We also do deal origination for them and do research and allow them to share their best practices.
And where are they moving their sense on decarbonization in the past year, or have they?
Absolutely. So to be a CREO member, you have to be active.
Okay.
We're highly selective of who we bring into the community, and so you need to be investing in the tens of million dollars a year. On average, our families invest about $60 million a year. And where they're investing, so back in 2010, these families were investing in solar. In fact, they partnered quite a bit because we started with American Families, partnered quite a bit with the government, really to create the unlocking of solar decarbonization in the early 2000s, and this is even post the financial crisis. So I'll talk a little bit about the appetite of families and their ability to be flexible and patient capital, a little bit like the pension funds. Today, it's interesting, over time, they moved from energy to food and agriculture, another big highly carbonized industry. But in the last few years, we're seeing a slowdown on the food and ag and uptake again in energy, mostly in storage. Definitely a lot of interest in hydrogen, a lot of interest, obviously, in CCUS. I'd say increasing interest in advanced nuclear. So that's on the solution side. We're also seeing our families moving from carve-out strategies where they'll say, I'll put 20% of my portfolio, 30% of my portfolio, 50% of my portfolio in direct investing in venture and private equity. We're now seeing families do whole portfolio, committing to net zero, just like the other asset owners are doing, larger asset owners are doing. And so in that case, you're really looking at how do you work with publicly listed companies to try to encourage them to deliver on their goals. There's also families who are looking at stranded assets or figuring out how to monetize, doing early retirement of coal assets. So we really do invest across the spectrum, across the different sectors and asset classes.
Good, very good. Jan.
Yes, I'm from Holcim, the largest building materials company globally, and we are committed to decarbonize construction and building. So not only decarbonizing our own operations and our products, but decarbonize the way we build and the way we operate buildings. You ask about what has changed under the current challenging economic environment. I think there is no alternative for decarbonization. That has to be our future. I think we all agree we have to accelerate. Even the current difficult geopolitical situation, the war in the Ukraine, is maybe even accelerating the need for a better energy future. I mean, for us, the peaking of energy prices, of power cost is even accelerating our strategy to go fully with green energy and with renewable energy. So in a way, while the economic challenges have also been steep for us to face this hyperinflation and make it happen, on the other hand, I think it accelerates a lot on the renewable energies and the green energy we need for the future. So I'm positive, and there's no alternative on decarbonization. If you're not fast enough, the cost of climate change are going to be much bigger than the current challenges we're having.
Understood. Noel.
So HSBC, as many of you all know, have been around for 157 years. We have a $3 trillion balance sheet. About 1.1 trillion of that is direct lending to businesses and individuals. And we touch pretty much every sector of the economy, industrial sector, construction, transportation, manufacturing, technology. So from my point of view, we put out a commitment a couple of years ago that we would facilitate or directly finance up to $1 trillion of sustainable or transition financing between now and the end of 2030. And so far, we're about 170 billion through that. I'll say in the early days, that was more green bonds or sustainability-linked bonds. More recently, that's much more on balance sheet lending to projects such as hydrogen. We've done wind and solar for many years, but hydrogen, sustainable aviation fuel, other projects, battery, energy projects. So more and more that's going on balance sheet rather than capital markets. And in terms of what have I seen in the last 12 months, in all of the conversations I've had with clients, the pace of change is accelerating. I don't see the environment having slowed down the desire to move to renewables, the desire to build new projects. I don't see that has changed negatively. If anything, I've seen it has changed positively. And the need is even greater today than it was 12 months ago. There is also a recognition, because the world is never binary, that you can't just switch off today. It's about transitioning from today to tomorrow. So build the tomorrow as fast as you can. And our job is to help finance that as a debt provider, but also acknowledge that there is an infrastructure there today that's also under pressure and that needs support as well. And our commitment is to finance the transition. It's clearly to finance green, but it's also to finance those companies of today that have capabilities, balance sheets, assets of today that need to change over the next 30 years, and therefore finance the transition, not just finance the green.
Very good. Lei.
Right. So Envision is initially we are making wind turbines, and then we gradually making batteries. So, and later on we start to creating digital solution for decarbonization. So now we are one of the top 3 wind turbine manufacturers and also leading battery manufacturer. Today we are building 10 gigafactories around the world. And for this digital platform, so we are managing 500 gigawatt energy assets around the world. So the logic, so for us, starting wind turbine to battery to digital, is that we think wind turbine is a new coal, is having the high percentage of renewable electricity is a first important part. Then the second part, and the battery is the new oil. So you basically is increase the electrification. Even you have high percentage of renewable energy, but without high percentage of electrification, from 20% today to 80%, you cannot decarbonize the economy. Then the logic for digital is we have so much renewable energy around the world, intermittent, distributed, and lots of EV. You need a system to orchestrate. So that's a digital platform for decarbonization. Think about it, as you said, we are putting like $200 trillion physical assets. What is the role for digital solutions? So 1% efficiency increase, then you think about 200 trillion performance yield. So that's the most important part. I think in the future, deal with this renewable energy system. So we are going to have 100% renewable energy system. How are we going to orchestrate this new energy system? It's become very critical.
Very good. And any change in your strategic direction in the past year based on war, inflation, supply chain challenges?
Right. So last year, we make 2 big important actions. Firstly is we moving to green hydrogen. We take actions. We're making electrolyzers. Now we start kicking off the construction of largest green ammonia project ongoing, so which is 1.5 million ton green ammonia. And the phase 1 will be completed middle next year.
Okay.
So we are taking real actions, because if you see lots of green hydrogen, green ammonia project, normally they'll be waiting after 2025, 2026. Let's make it in the middle of 2023. And during COVID, Envision made another achievement, is create the world's first net zero industrial park. This net zero industrial park is basically combining renewable energy production with the energy intensive industrials. So basically to replace grid. Think about today. So we have abundant renewable energy resources. The cost is so low. Why we cannot achieving net zero overnight? Because there's mismatching between load center and the renewable energy center. Now we are moving this load center to the energy center. You basically is going to speed up. So what we found is extremely important is we are able to fight against the inflation. 100% from renewable energy, and the cost is 50% lower than fossil fuel, than coal-fired power plant. We build in Inner Mongolia, Erdos. That's a place actually producing 18% of coal of China. So this has become a very important template for this green industrial revolution.
Good. Thank you. So we've got about $750 billion a year of energy transition investment at the moment. More than half of that is in renewable energy, power, and then the bulk of the rest of it is electrified transport or energy storage, basically batteries. But the challenging thing is to really do the rest of this, to do the sorts of things to help decarbonize your business, Jan. We need trillions of dollars, and we have at the moment about maybe 50 billion a year going into it. And so I'm curious if you could give us a sense of like what your transformation need is going to be. Like what can this collective group here do to help get us from 50 billion a year to $1 trillion a year, and what's going to work for you?
I think the good news is we have most of the technology we need is available, like yours. So that's the great news. And now it's about scaling up and speed. And this is, I'm not sure if that's only a function from financing, but also to make it happen, or we need a lot of also rules, not rules, standards from the governments, how to do this. I think we have sustainability has not become a full part of the economic framework like other parameters. So we struggle in various markets where sustainability is not part of the economic framework for companies or part of the incentive scheme, which is very important. In Europe, we have the CO2 certificate market, which gives a very good payback for investments in sustainability. And we're missing that scheme, for example, in other markets to be faster and then to finance it. Because investments in sustainability, they have to be profitable. And in our case, they have been, over the last 5 years, the fastest payback investments because obviously with the increase in energy costs, with the increase in CO2 pricing in Europe, they have been on a very fast payback track. And this is what we need also in other markets.
Good.
If I could just add, firstly, what Envision's doing is eminently financeable, and the finance will go. And in fact, we spoke just about 2 hours ago about the finance. That's all doing. The challenge that very often happens is a lot of these projects, are they done as standalone renewable energy projects outside of today's corporate infrastructure and put into an SPV? Right. Or can you achieve that requirement within an existing company, a company that's transitioning from brown to green? And if the world bifurcates, if the world goes binary, and everything green and sustainable is in an SPV and everything brown is in today's corporate structure, the overall cost of capital is going to go up. Yeah. Because the brown will become stranded, and the cost of capital will go up, people won't want to fund it. And the green has a huge amount of concentration risk, project development risk, financing risk, execution risk, no cash flows to support it. The cost of capital there will be higher. So the trick is to try and leverage as much as you can the corporate infrastructure of today and take them on that journey and help them on a journey. Because they've got the engineering skills, they've got the project management skills, they know their industry inside out. And if they're committed to transition, we should all be willing to finance that. There then is a different group of projects which are very heavily dependent on government policy.
Yep. Good.
So is there an offtake agreement? Is it sustainable? Will it survive administration change? Those sort of projects, particularly in the developing markets, needs a combination of public sector and private sector finance. They can't survive alone without public policy, public sector funding, and private sector funding. There's two different categories.
Understood.
And just adding on that, from our perspective, obviously we invest a lot in early stage technologies, and we're certainly seeing an important gap in terms of getting the new technology, which obviously is managed by a team of entrepreneurs who understand equity really well, but they don't understand project finance really well. We're seeing a huge problem there. And so getting the entrepreneurs to understand how do you actually prepare a project, and because it's much more complex than equity, and making sure that the developers can also understand the technology, there's a real gap there. And so we're seeing a huge problem in terms of financing, not post, we're at least in our community, the investments we're doing, we're seeing kind of the pilot project being financed because our families can bring philanthropic capital and concessionary capital to those projects. But project 1 to 5 are very hard to finance. And we talked last night, HSBC is one of those leaders who are kind of willing to do the hard work to come into some of those projects, but most lenders are not. And so some of our families were trying to figure out how to kind of create new strategies and financial engineering to be able to, alongside government with the IRA, for example, to make sure that these projects are financed.
And just to back it up, my Chief Risk Officer, Pam, is in the audience to make sure I don't overpromise and underdeliver.
No overpromise.
You can see us all chuckling. The sort of it's a story as old as time. The mismatch between, in some cases, the entrepreneur and the lender in terms of expectations and project finance. Getting some questions. Keep them coming, please. I'd like to have too many to answer, but I've got one to pose back here, and I think I'll start with you for this one, Lei, which is that I find a lot of these conversations can be very abstract, especially in a rising rates environment. And I went back and did a little bit of math with some things that my colleagues at Bloomberg NEF have collated. Since 2004, there's been about $4.4 trillion worth of asset finance in energy transition, of which 3.6 trillion have taken place in an almost zero interest rate or near zero interest rate environment. And that's very suddenly not the case anymore. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, as you go to the capital market to begin asset financing, how are you reacting to the current rate environment that we have?
Right. So, the renewable energy assets, no matter wind farm, solar farm, or hydrogen project, is kind of, is a fixed capex and steady return, and it should be the best for, for financings. But what we found, actually, the real challenge today, for instance, the green hydrogen project we are doing is not, we know the role of finance is for scaling up is very important. It's about the contract for difference. So we need to create a long-term offtake contract for our green ammonia project or contract for difference. Think about UK offshore. UK offshore taking off because this contract for difference. So this kind of a mechanism will become more important when they creating the contract for difference. Then I think it will give lots of comfort to the financial institution. They are willing to give a lower interest rate. Mm-hmm. So this is more fundamental.
So listen, the interest rate environment of the past 5 years, and you could argue for most of the past 10 years, was an artificial interest rate environment.
Yes.
0% interest is not normal. These projects will not fall over because of a 2% interest rate or a 3% interest rate. That's eminently financeable. That's not an issue. Now, for a period of time, we could be facing interest rates above that level to control inflation, but that's not the permanent interest rate level. The normalized interest rates are going to be in the 2 to 3%, and these projects can stand 2 to 3%. But I absolutely agree. In some markets, the contract for difference is more important for the new technology than the borrowing cost on the deal. Because the unit cost of energy for those new projects is going to be maybe 3 times higher than today's energy production. Not for wind or solar, but for some of the others. And it's a matter for governments to then work out, are they going to create the fiscal capacity to get some of these projects to scale for the first 5 to 10 years using contract for difference? That is going to be a much more important deal breaker on these projects than a 2% interest rate.
Got it. And Jan, in your work, like what would an equivalent novel construct be? Something contractual that allows you to do things where cost of capital might become a current issue, or where there's technology risk. Like how would you think about something similar? And what would you ask of policymakers and of the market?
Well, in our specific case, we are a building materials company, so we depend on developing the building codes. So we need the building codes to develop in all markets towards allowing us to use more recycling in our products. We can already today use up to 50% construction demolition waste into our products, and that's a big part of our investments to make all our metropolitan markets circular economies for construction. The biggest hurdle I have is the building codes which are not developed to that level yet. So I can do already 50% of recycling in my products, and the building codes allow maybe 10 to 20% at the moment. So this needs to be developed, and some markets are faster. In some European markets, we already have permits for these super new recycled products, and other markets need a few years extra to approve the product. So that's one of our biggest challenges we have.
But this is a very different conversation than 5 years ago, when what we would be hearing was, we need a carbon price, we need a global accord or a compact. These are actually doable things. Like a contract for difference exists in a professional realm that people understand. Building codes are localized or regionalized. And this is, not to sound quite so much like our previous moderator, Jerry, saying this gives me hope, but this gives me a frame of reference in which things can happen that are not too abstract. So it's interesting to hear that.
Yeah, the challenge for many governments is, particularly in the developing markets, is convincing private sector finance on issues such as political risk and issues such as currency risk. You know, private sector equity and debt can get their head around development risk, can get their head around operating risk post-development. But many of the challenges come about by, will successive changes of administration unpick the offtake agreement or change the price in the offtake agreement? Will they unpick the subsidy or lower the subsidy that's offered? That risk is very hard for private sector equity or debt to cover. And that's where there is a role for the MDBs to come in. But for that to happen, I think the MDBs have got to change their business model, where today they tend to go vertical risk, covering all risk categories on a project. I think there's got to be more of a horizontal view, where they come in and take slices of risk off the table and use their capacity to do that for certain countries. And then the private sector can come in and do the development and operating risk. And private sector equity and debt will do it. And that's one of the challenges in certain types of projects where there is a big concentration of risk: political, currency, development, new technology, unproven cash flows, in an SPV with no contingency. That package of risks in certain markets can be tough.
I would say so. I think that's a very diplomatic way of stating it.
So building on that, developing markets is definitely yet another challenge, and it's needed in the decarbonization transition. Yes, we have to figure out how to get the MDBs to crowd in more capital, and right now, in some cases, they're actually crowding out capital because of how they're structured, and that is a problem. We are seeing more and more blended finance structures, but the problem there is that they work. Typically, you'll see up to $1 billion in a structure, but they take sometimes up to 3 years to put together, because we talked a lot about collaboration over the last day and a half. Sometimes the incentives don't align across all the different players that need to come into this blended finance. And so it takes time. And there's no blueprint for this. And so I think if we're going to talk about not only deploying the capital, but accelerating the amount of capital that goes into these projects, we need to figure out new mechanisms to centralize de-risking functions around FX risk and geopolitical risk. There is talk, also I heard it a few times on different stages, around creating the new Bretton Woods for the climate era. That perhaps it is time for not just governments, but also different stakeholders to come to the table and think about a centralized function that would actually allow the MDBs to do more of the work that we and they want to do. So that's one idea that's being kind of loosely talked about.
Loosely talked about, thank you. I've got a question from the floor, and it's reflections. Who here was at COP? You were in COP?
I was at COP.
Anybody else?
You were at COP.
Reflections. Tell me what it was like. For my sins, I've never been to one. So this is partly for me, but also for the larger room. Tell me what you thought about this year.
So, good questions. From Envision side, we see opportunities. because we do not want to transform ourselves. We're helping people transform themselves. So many customers, so they're asking for support for decarbonization plans. But what I'm seeing is the first time COP in Africa. So there are abundant renewable energy in Africa. And they also have abundant mineral resources. So there is great opportunity for Egypt to build a green industrial system based on green energy. So we clearly see the strong motivation of Egyptian government. So they want to build wind turbine industry, batteries, storage, hydrogens, so lots of announcement. Again, lots of announcement. But again, what we think, we need speed. We need something should happen really fast. That's something, every time I go to COP, I have this impression. We need speed. We need to take real actions.
Very good. No?
The conversations were much more granular this year than last year in Glasgow. Last year was more about commitments, big numbers, concepts. We talked about, while I was there, 4 specific country plans. Egypt was one of them, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Africa. We're involved particularly in the Vietnam, Indonesia, and Egypt. And the portfolio of energy projects there, I think, adds up to around about $15 billion. We talked specifically about the structure, how blended finance can work for Egypt, how it could work for Vietnam. So we were more down in the detail of this is what the role of the MDB should be, MDBs on some of those projects. And we talked about taking horizontal risk, not vertical. They were around the table. So it was a more granular discussion. I think the other thing that we discussed, there were a lot of standard setters there as well. We talked about disclosures. And we talked about the most important disclosure, I certainly put into it, the most important disclosure a company can make is not their current carbon footprint, it's their transition plan. Knowing today is interesting. Knowing how you're going to get from today to 10 years from now and 20 years from now, even if there are some blank spots on that transition plan, you don't quite know. That narrative of how a company is going to transform itself is the most important document of the future, and not enough companies are publishing that document today. And I was encouraging the standard setters not to put so much energy into just measuring today and forget about how you disclose for tomorrow. And I don't think there's a good answer on that.
Fair enough. One moment, because I've got one for you, specifically for you, Jan, which is what's the biggest lever for decarbonizing building and construction?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly for you. So
there are many levers. I think I'm fascinated to make energy efficient buildings. So to have a properly insulated building, to have proper renewable sources for the energy you need. I think that's actually the biggest single lever you have. We have about 70% of the carbon footprint in operating the building, and 30% is in building the building. So where we focus on the biggest lever is to make energy efficient buildings, and that's can be happen today. We have all technology to have proper windows, proper insulation material, have clean energy sources, but we have to do it.
Okay, very good. Regine, you wanted to get a word in, I think.
Just building on kind of the outcomes of COP, I think, so data and accountability definitely is a big theme again, and so for disclosure, but also for carbon markets. I don't think we're going to get there without properly functioning carbon markets, and ideally they're regulated, but in the absence of the growth of regulated carbon markets, voluntary carbon markets need to work better, and we need credible credits both on the additionality, but also on permanence. And we did see quite a few announcements coming out on that topic. So,
did you any reflection?
Yeah. There was a level of realism on voluntary carbon markets and the disclosures, and there's a purist view, which is there's only a fraction of the things that people do for offset that will qualify, and then there's more modified view, which says, let's not be so purist that we stop investment flows into certain projects that have a positive impact on the carbon footprint. I don't think there was a resolution to that debate, right. but at least there was from the senior players around the table, the standard setters, there was an acknowledgement that there needs to be realism. and purists will not achieve the ultimate goal. It's about progressive improvement, not just about something that's absolute. There was an acknowledgement of that. Still a long way to go.
Yeah.
By the way, carbon pricing, my personal view, will never happen. Voluntary carbon markets will.
Yeah.
That's where the carbon price will emerge. We couldn't get governments globally to agree a coordinated approach on COVID. The chances of getting the governments of the world to agree on a standard methodology for carbon pricing is not that high. Do I think voluntary carbon markets can set the stage? Yeah, I do. I think they can. They can do it.
Any thought to that? Briefly, we're very close to time, but what do the carbon markets mean for Envision, especially as you look out several years?
Yeah, I think same thing to the contract for difference. As long as they are pricing for carbon, then you are able to really measure the project cash flow, which is you're going to create. Then everything can become financeable. So this is also either invest by venture capital or private equity or the bank. So this is very critical.
Yeah, very good. So we're almost at time. And in fact, we're so close to time that I'm going to have to pose my question as a sort of rhetorical one for everybody, which is, this event is now its 5th year. And I imagine we'll still be here 10 years hence. And so what I would urge all of you to think about in your time is reflecting, looking backwards on these conversations, on the issues that we talked about, on the ideas that we covered. What were we too pessimistic about? What were the things that we thought were going to be either impossible to do or they were just not worth trying? And what are the things that we were not optimistic enough about? Like, what were the things that turned out to be far easier than we thought? Not something that we can probably answer right now, but file that away in your heads for the time that you're thinking about this, looking back in the future. My own reflection is that we've managed to do a lot of things that were science experiment level of difficulty and abstraction, have now become core parts of our system. We've already won some of these battles. We just have to sort of scale them up further. And I think that we'll find the same across many different things that we see here, from hydrogen to buildings materials, to road transportation, to carbon markets, to things within the capital markets. So I would urge us all to just think of what continues to be possible as time goes on. And when we're 10 years now looking back, let's hope that most of those things turned out to be easier and moved faster than we thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Chief Executive Officer of TikTok, Shou Chew, and Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Bloomberg Editorial and Research, Reto Grigori.
Shou, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
We're the last show today, but we're going to talk about the opportunities and challenges for TikTok. And maybe we can start at the beginning. We all thought social media had been conquered by Facebook and others, and then suddenly you came out of nowhere. What did TikTok discover that the incumbents had missed?
I think fundamentally we have a different mission. Our mission is to inspire creativity and to bring joy to our users. And the way we present it is through a vision of 3 things, a combination of 3 things. We give our users a window to discover. So when you open the app, it's a For You page. And you can scroll endlessly through and discover delightful new things. We also give our users a canvas to create. And these are the tools that help people express themselves so that they can inspire the creativity on the platform. And finally, we have bridges to connect communities. So there are many people who tell us that through using TikTok, they have discovered communities, and through that, built bridges with many people. So that's what we intend to deliver. And I think we have a unique proposition in the market, and that's underpinning, the reason why we could grow as a product.
I mean, users often commend your algorithm for knowing what they're interested in based on passive signals, for example, how long they watch certain videos. How does your algorithm work, and how do you make sure that it will continue to get better?
The algorithm works on machine learning. So as you use the app, there are behavioral signals that you exhibit as a user. For example, do you stay on the video? Do you scroll through it? Do you like it? Do you share it? Do you comment on it? And what the algorithm does is, it takes all these signals, it puts it through a machine learning algorithm, it learns and it tries to match your behavior with content that is the best fit for you. So it's all mathematics at the back of it.
Obviously now the others are trying to catch up. What do you make of all the copycats? I mean, you have Instagram and Reels, you have YouTube with the Shorts. Elon Musk has at least mused about bringing back Vine. How worried are you that they're going to get it right and do something similar?
I think, first of all, competition is a great thing for the market. It gives the users more choices. Short video is clearly a very, very effective way for people to communicate with each other. So it doesn't really come as a surprise that many other products are adapting and adopting the short video format. For us, again, we come back to this. We believe we have a very unique mission and vision that we want to build. And every other company is a little bit different like that. So we're very confident in our ability to deliver our mission to our users in a way that the competitors won't be able to.
Let's talk about one of the competitors. Just got bought by Elon Musk. I'm sure you're enjoying the show, but what exactly are the opportunities that you see as he sort of experiments, shall we say, with Twitter?
Well, I'm sure, like many of you in this room, I'm following the news of what Elon is doing and the changes that he's making at Twitter. I think it's a little bit too early to tell. And to be fair, what we are seeing is a little bit of the changes that is public. And I'm sure there are many other changes internally. So I'm not sure it is very fair to comment on where he's taking the company at this point. I think it's a bit too early to tell.
I mean, it's unusual, shall we say, that you can fire half the workforce and your company is still going. What would happen to TikTok if you fired half the workforce?
I hope that day never comes. The way we are organized is one where we don't need to lay off half the workforce to achieve the efficiency levels that we want to achieve.
But just coming back to Twitter, do you think you can actually run a company with half the staff, any company?
I don't know the situation at Twitter in detail. For many tech companies, including ourselves, one of the largest teams that you will have is your trust and safety team, which is not only the people who design the policies around community guidelines, but the people who complement the machines in terms of content moderation and protecting the platform and making sure that the content is very safe. Now, that is an investment that I think is not definitely worthwhile if you want to keep the platform a very safe platform.
How many people do you have in content moderation?
It's in the tens of thousands.
Obviously, you're in a pretty unique position. You have a China-based owner, ByteDance. You have a very big business in America. There's a lot to navigate. The previous administration tried to force your sale. Now you have Marco Rubio and Mike Gallagher. They want to ban you. Yesterday, FBI Director Chris Wray says he's extremely concerned about your app, and all this comes in the middle of a security review in America. Are you a little bit nervous about your future?
The first thing I would say to all the reports is that we clearly pay a lot of attention to it. And national security concerns are concerns that we take extremely seriously. As we have disclosed in the past, we have had discussions with the US government, mainly through CFIUS. And if you saw the FBI director's comments this morning, Singapore time, he made comments that they are working through that process as well. And I'm very confident, because it's confidential, so I cannot talk about the details, but I'm very confident that through the detailed discussions that we're going to have, we will come up with a solution that will reasonably address the national security concerns that the policymakers have.
They are, all the negotiations obviously are confidential, but can you tell us, I mean, where you're moving to? I mean, everyone is aware of Project Texas, I think.
I think to give the crowd a bit more context, the way consumer internet companies like ourselves traditionally deal with data access is on a requirement basis, which means that your engineers and your employees get access to certain kinds of user data based on a rigorous set of protocols, which is underpinned by requirement. If you're required to build a product, if you require access to a certain set of data to build a product, you have to justify it, and through the protocols, you get access to it. No consumer internet company that I know of organizes access to data by nationality. Nobody does, you know, you are from this country, you're sitting in this country, you therefore don't have access to certain kinds of data. Now, in the future, we are building a very rigorous and robust new model. This is pioneering. And we have internally named this Project Texas. And the way this is going to be done is that we're going to move the data that we store in Virginia and in Singapore into Oracle's cloud infrastructure. That's our partner. Oracle's going to look after it for us. We're going to have new and improved data access protocols such that only an entity of US residents that in the US will have access to a certain set of US protected data. So that's the setup that we're going to have. It's unprecedented. No company has attempted this. It's extremely expensive and difficult to build, but that's the project that we're undertaking at this point.
What's the timeline for that?
It's something that we have been working on for quite some time, and hopefully in the near future we can make more announcements on the milestones that we have hit.
But, so going forward, the Chinese government will have no access to US data or European data?
The way we have built this is going forward, only a group of employees who sit in the US under a special entity will have access to certain kinds of US data.
Now, if the Biden administration goes back to the Trump view and tries to force a sale, do you have a plan B?
Because of the discussions that we are having with the US government, we are confident we can come with a reasonable solution to the national security issues. And so we are confident that that's a situation we can avoid.
So there's no plan B? Okay. You already mentioned platform safety and security. You said, I think, or you made that one of your top priorities, both for you and for the company. In an interview with David Rubenstein in March, I mean, you mentioned some of the goals, that making sure that the community guidelines are well understood, making sure that we have the tools and capabilities to have a safe environment. It sounds a little vague. Can you give us some example, or one example, what exactly you're doing, so we can make sure that a 10-year-old doesn't watch bad stuff?
In a nutshell, the way we think about our platform is that we have a set of rules. And there are 14 of them. They're public. You can search for them. They're called community guidelines. And they determine what is allowed and not allowed on our platform. You know, it's stuff like we don't allow violence. You know, we don't allow pornography, so on and so forth. There are 14 of them. The way we have designed them such that they're easy to understand and they're easy to operationalize internally. What we then do is that we build policies around these community guidelines. We train our machines to recognize content that violates the guidelines, that takes down the content. We also have, as we talked about, a significant trust and safety team of content moderators who make sure they can complement the machines. And as our growth user base continues to grow and the platform grows in terms of the number of videos that are being uploaded, we are investing more and more to make sure that we're staying ahead of the growth in terms of keeping the platform very safe. Now, why do we care so much about this? Because our mission is to inspire creativity and to bring joy. And if we don't have a safe and trusted platform, it's very difficult for people to inspire each other and bring joy to each other. So this is something that we take extremely seriously. And since the time I've been in my role, I've made this a very, very top priority for us.
So you expect the 10-year-old or the 12-year-old to read the guidelines before they sign up, or how does that work?
Our app is designed for people who are 13 and above.
If you're a 10-year-old, a 10-year-old could say, I'm 13, right? My 10-year-old does that all the time.
The app is designed for users who are 13 and above. If you're below 13, in certain countries like the United States, you get a very different experience. In many other countries, you're not allowed to use the app. Now, for parents in this room, I strongly urge you to comply with this. But if your teenage children are using the platform and you want to have additional protection for them, please go to settings. There's something called family pairing. And under family pairing, there is a series of tools that we have built for parents and guardians to make sure that they understand the experience that their children are having, that their teenage children are having on TikTok, including the ability to restrict. There's a restricted mode where even more content is restricted on the platform, sort of beyond the experience that you would have as an 18-plus user.
Let's zoom out a little bit. The global tech industry obviously is going through a reckoning. How has that affected your business, your ability to raise capital, your relationship with your shareholders? Is it tougher?
Like every other company, we cannot escape a global slowdown. So the economy, is clearly not what it was at even 12 months ago, and we are not immune to it as a business. At this stage of our growth, we believe that the most important thing is to continue to build the tools to add value to our advertisers and our customers and our users and people who use our platform to make a living. And there are many, many businesses like that. And we believe that as long as we do that, we're on the right track. So even though there's a slowdown, even though it obviously hurts us like every other company, I think it's something that's manageable within our company at this stage.
So Facebook is firing 11,000 people. Amazon is going to fire people. Are you slowing down hiring at least, or are you also eliminating some roles?
We have always been more cautious in terms of recruitment. So at this stage of our growth, I think our cadence of hiring is just right for us. We are still hiring, although at a pace that we think corresponds with the global challenges that we're facing.
Right. I think the FT reported the other day that you reduced the sales forecast for 2022, I think, by 2 billion or so.
Well, it was an internal discussion.
Right.
I think
somehow made it into the newspaper.
It did.
But ballpark, is that right?
I think ballpark is important for companies to adjust to the economic reality and to make sure that you are investing at the right pace for yourself.
Right. So to revive growth, what can you do in the slowdown? Do you have any innovations coming, anything surprising?
In terms of the product, I think probably the most important thing is to really just listen to your users. Listen to what they want and make sure that you're delivering this for them. For us, for example, I just came back from London. And one of the things that I do when I travel is that we get together creators and users and businesses that are on our platform, and we speak to them. And we ask them, and I met met a whole series of people, but there was this one that really stuck with me. It was a gentleman who used to work at a big tech company. He really didn't like his job, but he really liked baking. So he started making cookies for his team, and his team was like, "You're so good at this, you should do this for a living." So he did. He started a company. He does these pre-baked cookies. Really fun. Some of them in a mug, you put it in the oven, it becomes cookies. And then for a period of time, it was difficult to build that business. But sometime in May this year, he discovered us. And because our e-commerce platform services are available in the UK, he started selling his product on our platform. And he was raving about it because it gave him exposure to a whole new demographic, the whole new crowd that he never had before. And it's stories like that. We listen to him and the tools that he needs to build this business. Do you need more tools? How do we make sure that we invest to make it easier for him to reach out to the audience that he wants and to sell the products that he wants on our platform? That is, our focus. We want to make sure that we continue to do this. And yes, there could be an economic slowdown, but as long as we're building this, we think that we're on the right track.
Do you have more examples where users told you to do something, where you actually changed?
Oh, yeah, many of them. Another great story that I heard, also from London, was there was this couple. Husband is, the wife has curly hair. The husband has no hair at this point. They found our platform a couple of years ago. And what she did was she started posting short videos about her curly hair. The account is called Only Curls UK, I believe, or Only Curls London. And she found a community. There was a community of people in the UK with curly hair, and they really liked her short videos. And at some point, she decided to sell things to the community. So beanies that doesn't, mess up your curly hair, and it became a proper business. They told us that they started with something like 500 pounds of capital, and now they're making millions in revenue per year. Every story like that, everywhere we go, you hear stories of people, small businesses, finding and leveraging our platform, finding their communities, and then building something very meaningful out of it. And that's the mission that we want to deliver, inspire creativity, bring joy. This creativity is not the narrow definition of creating a short video. It is unleashing sort of human productivity and that kind of creativity.
We're out of time, but I always ask people, I mean, if you could turn back the clock, what's the one thing you would do differently with the company?
We always say that the most important thing for us, apart from growing the business today, is to earn trust, particularly with non-users. And today, a number of policymakers are not users of our platform. Now, if we had more time, I think trust is not something you earn overnight. There is no one big thing I can do to make everybody trust me. I think what we need to do is to identify consistent actions that we need to take, addressing concerns that policymakers have, building solutions around those, making sure that we are very, very consistent in the way we behave. And through that, through a substantial period of time, earn trust from everyone. So if I had more time, that's the one thing I would want to do. If I had more time to earn that trust, I think, as a business, we would be in a much better place to deliver the mission that we want to deliver.
So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Chief Executive Officer of Bloomberg Media, Scott Havens.
We're almost there. Good afternoon, everyone. We've come to the end of day 2 of the New Economy Forum, a day focused on rebuilding. This morning we awoke to the news that missiles had struck Poland. The origin we're still finding out. That was a setback, no question. But it also underscores the need for businesses and governments to prepare for a future of much fewer or more fewer challenges and less uncertainty. In other words, the need to rebuild our economies more sustainably and more forward-thinking. Today, with that as our guide, we talked about how to accelerate growth without stimulus, how to alleviate the food crisis, how to restore and encourage trust in the digital economy, how to marshal capital amid turmoil and fuel innovation, how to build a sustainable model for sustainable investing, and how to decarbonize the warming planet. Once again, let's relive some of today's great highlights briefly behind me.
The war is really adding fuel to an already burning fire as opposed to having created it. And a lot of these changes that we've experienced in our food systems really started 2 to 3 years ago.
We need to really drive cyber knowledge and cyber defense knowledge at large scales. That's the one thing that keeps me up at night is who's going to attack us.
The big tech giants who have taken advantage of this for far too long. They've taken advantage of a no-rules barred approach.
ASEAN is booming. India is booming. Korea will benefit. Japan will benefit, but in smaller ways. But this part of the world is absolutely the growth engine.
The world is changing, so not thinking about ESG or climate change would not be prudent.
Well, it's the entire economy that needs to transition. It's aviation, it's steel, cement. The entire economy needs to transition.
There's a shortage of capital in the world for these sort of investments. there is no shortage of capital. There's plenty of capital.
Tomorrow, our final day, it will be our day of revival. And I look forward to seeing you here tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. But tonight is our gala dinner. So join us at 6 p.m. at the Fullerton Bay Hotel. Transportation will be provided from official Forum hotels every 10 minutes, starting at 5 p.m. We have a special guest tonight, so make sure you're there. And I will see you here tomorrow. Thank you.